All right, back on the Young Turks. Now we've got an interview that I'm very interested in. It is Professor Michael Coogan. He's the author of the book God and Sex, What the Bible Really Says. Professor Coogan is a professor of religious studies at Stonehill College. He's the editor of the New Oxford Annotated Bible. He is also taught at Harvard and Wellesley. He's a biblical scholar. It's great to have him on here, Professor Coogan. Welcome to the Young Turks.
Oh, thank you very much.
All right. First, you just reassure us that in the Bible, marriage is between one man and one woman, right? I mean, I hear that all the time. That must be true, right?
Sometimes it is, but a lot of the time it isn't.
What?
Sorry to disappoint you.
So what other kinds of relationships are in the Bible?
Well, one of the most common, especially in earlier times, is polygamy. Many of the great figures of earlier biblical history, such as Abraham and Jacob and David and Solomon, had multiple wives.
Badass. Okay, Solomon had what, 300 wives?
300 wives and 600 concubines, I think. So he was
oh, damn, I didn't even know about the concubines.
Busy guy.
Yeah, apparently so, man. That'd take a while to get through. So, is there any part in the Bible where it says, okay, all right, that's fine, Solomon's, you know, he's pimping over there, but really the way to go, the standard is marriage between one man and one woman. Is there a part where it says that?
Well, there are parts that imply that, and are earlier parts that are quoted to that effect, especially the story of the Garden of Eden, where, of course, there was only one man and one woman. So,
but they were the only ones who existed. It's not like they had a choice.
That's exactly right. But what happened was that as Judaism developed, monogamy more and more became the norm. And so when Christianity emerged from Judaism, it adopted that monogamous principle. But it wasn't always that way from the beginning.
Do Adam and Eve ever get married in the Bible?
Not explicitly, not as far as we know. They're just together. One of the problems in the Bible is that the word for wife is also the same word for woman. So when it says, for example, that Adam knew his wife, a biblical euphemism, we could also translate it, Adam knew his woman. And there certainly is no marriage ceremony for them described.
And is he ever described as her husband?
He's described as her man.
Her man, okay. Well, you know, they're together. But like I said, there isn't very many options. So, and then if they're going to multiply from Adam and Eve, by definition, doesn't there have to be incest in the next generation?
If you're going to take the Bible literally, obviously there has to be incest. But I think we shouldn't interpret these stories too literally. They're like many cultures have. They're myths, really, of origins of how we got to be the way we are, and we shouldn't interpret them as what actually happened.
No. Professor Coogan, I'm told by evangelical right-wing Christians in this country that every word of the Bible is true. So I want to be very careful about taking it literally. So I am now allowed, I suppose, because King Solomon wasn't punished, right, for the 300 wives and the 600 concubines? That was totally fine?
He wasn't, but after his death, his son was. So.
Oh, okay, good for him. Okay, so I'm going to take that literally, meaning that I could have 300 wives and 600 concubines, and right-wing Christians in this country should be totally fine with that, right?
They should be. And in fact, another group, which is also derived from Judaism and Christianity, Mormons, fundamentalist Mormons, still hold for polygamy precisely because that's what the Bible says.
All right, and now the Bible also says something else about sex. It says that sodomy is totally not allowed, and you're not going to tell me that ain't true, is it?
No, it is. That's exactly what it says.
Okay, good.
It says, at least if a man lies with a man as with a woman, it says it's an abomination. And there's no equivocating about that. So when people quote that in opposition to same-sex relationships or same-sex marriage, they're absolutely right. That is what the Bible says. But the point I make in the book is that the Bible also says that they should both be put to death. And I'm not sure that any except the most rabid would enforce the death penalty for same-sex couples. I'd also point out that there are all sorts of other abominations in the Bible that people fairly blithely ignore. Women wearing men's clothes. I guess women shouldn't wear pants because that's an abomination. Eating pork for many people is common, and yet the Bible calls that an abomination too. So to choose one abomination over all the others, I think, is selective use of the Bible.
You know, I've always wondered about this because, you know, I quote the shellfish part in Leviticus all the time. So if you eat shrimp, it's an abomination, as is lying with a man, right?
Right.
You know, very similar to what you just said. But does that mean that the people who are eating shrimp or ham or any of that stuff, should they also be put to death, or is there different categories of abominations?
Well, there are different categories of abomination, but the death penalty was imposed for all sorts of crimes according to biblical law, very few of which we would insist that it be imposed for adultery, for prostitution, for children who curse their parents. For all of these offenses, the death penalty is prescribed.
All right. Yeah. No, I'm very important to take the Bible absolutely literally. I'm sure that right-wing Christians in this country agree with all of that too. So now you mentioned something about how, you know, because you read the Bible in its original languages. Am I right about that first?
That's right. All the texts that I translate in the book, I translated myself.
All right. Now, you mentioned something about sodomy not necessarily meaning sodomy. What's that part?
Well, sodomy is an English word derived from the name of the town of Sodom, but it's not used. The word, there is no word in the biblical languages for sodomy derived from Sodom, and what went on at Sodom, although it was more rape than sodomy in our sense, than homosexual anal penetration. And most scholars, in going back to the Bible itself, interpret what was going on at Sodom not primarily as a kind of homosexual inclination, but rather as a violation of a fundamental ancient principle of hospitality.
Right. So raping your guests is what they were against, not
That's
necessarily
right.
homosexuality.
Regardless of their gender.
You know what? If the right-wing Christians were saying that, I'd be in favor. Yeah, we shouldn't rape the guests. No.
Right.
Okay, see, we could have agreement if we interpreted the Bible right.
Yeah, and I think, and the prophet Ezekiel says that that's only one. The main sin of Sodom was that they treated everybody, all the marginalized in society, improperly. They didn't feed the hungry. They didn't take care of the poor, and so forth. Their sins were social, not sexual.
So, not feeding the poor and helping perhaps, for example, unemployed, that would be sodomy?
Well, that would be the sin of Sodom.
Okay, all right. I'm just trying to get it clear. This is the part I did not know, and that's why I'm not a biblical scholar. I've read a lot of it, but I didn't read this part. So apparently there's references to God's, genitalia or his sex? I mean, what's the reference to?
Well, God has body parts in the Bible. He has hands, he has feet, he has eyes, he has ears, and so forth. And in one text, he also has loins, which is kind of generally the area around the genitals, the area between the waist and the hips.
Yeah.
And the prophet says he has fire in his loins. And I take that as a kind of jumping-off point for talking about God being described as a sexual being, both in myth, as in other ancient myths, and also metaphorically.
See, that's really interesting. First of all, just out of curiosity, does he do anything with the fire in his loins, or he just has the fire?
Well, he has children in myth. He has there are sons of God mentioned several times in the Jewish scriptures in the Old Testament, and
Not
of course
Jesus?
he is the father of Jesus through Mary. So presumably there is some sort of biological fathering going on there.
That's interesting. I didn't know outside of Jesus that he had fathered other sons. Are they named?
They are not named in the Bible, although in later tradition they are. But they are named in Genesis and in the book of Job and in other places. They form part of his heavenly court, so that God is sort of the head of a pantheon, like Zeus on Mount Olympus and the other gods sit around and consult with him and praise his creation and things like that.
So at that time, when the idea of Zeus coming and having sex with mortal women was fairly commonplace, it wouldn't have been that strange for God to have sons, or in the case of Christianity, for him to have, some sort of relationship with the Virgin Mary that produced a kid. That's very Zeus-like, isn't it?
That is actually very Zeus-like. And you're right, it wouldn't have surprised anybody in the world in which Christianity came to be that a god would impregnate a human virgin.
Fascinating. And we're talking to Michael Coogan. He's the professor who wrote the book God and Sex, What the Bible Really Says. And this is fascinating stuff to me. Let's talk about abortion. Another thing that right-wing Christians in this country tell me is that, man, if there is something rock solid in the Bible, it is that God is against abortion. Is that true?
Well, it's not just right-wing Christians, but even pro-choice people quote the Bible in support of their opposite position. And I find that amusing because, in fact, the Bible doesn't mention abortion at all. There's no text in the Bible that talks about abortion. There are texts that therefore have to be interpreted indirectly in support of either side, and because they can be interpreted either way, both sides can quote the Bible in support of their position. Biblical people didn't practice abortion, and that's why it doesn't come up at all.
But on the side saying that abortion is allowed in the Bible, I have read arguments and I've seen the text where they say, if you think your wife is cheating on you, have her drink some sort of poisonous water, and if she miscarries, then she was. If she doesn't, then she wasn't cheating on you, right?
Right.
Isn't that kind of advocating for abortion in that case?
Well, it does seem to be a kind of abortion. It's a very, very mysterious text. But it's not the husband who makes the wife drink the potion. It's the priest. The suspicious husband takes his wife before the priest, and he mixes the potion. And the idea behind that is that it's God ultimately who's the final judge. And if she miscarries, then God has found her guilty. So in a sense, I guess that would make God the abortionist, not the priest or any human intermediary.
Evangelical heads just exploded all over the country. All right, Professor Coogan, seriously, how did all these things come about? I mean, how do we have a country here where the great majority of the country is completely misinformed about what's in the Bible and thinks, like I said, all kidding aside, they think the most important thing in the Bible is that God's against abortion. If it's not mentioned in the Bible at all, how the hell did they come up with that idea?
Well, I think they've formed their views on all sorts of social issues, so-called family values, and then they look in the Bible for support of their previously arrived at positions, and because of the nature of the Bible, that's easy to do. The Bible was not handed down by God, in a shrink-wrap package delivered from Amazon or downloaded on a Kindle or iPad or something like that. The Bible was written over the course of more than 1,000 years by people who had very different views about all sorts of topics. And so it's easy to find in the Bible all sorts of inconsistencies and to choose from those inconsistencies texts that support a particular point of view.
So, Professor Coogan, when you argue with literalists, your points are overwhelming because not only have you studied the Bible, but you've read it in the original language, etc., and you're quoting Scripture. There's no way around it.
Right.
How do they answer it?
Well, we have good discussions, and when I teach, I sort of enjoy having fundamentalist students because it makes the other students think for themselves. Ultimately, one answer they give, which I don't find entirely satisfying, is that God put these little things in the Bible to test our faith. I'm not entirely happy with a God like that. I get email occasionally saying I myself am an abomination, and I find that amusing too.
Well, do you eat shrimp?
If I can afford it, yeah.
Aha! So all of a sudden, perhaps that's not so far off. All right, and then one last thing that I'm curious about, the role of women in the Bible. You also talk about that in your book.
Yeah.
How do women get treated in the Bible?
Well, as I was saying, the Bible was written a long time ago by people from different culture and with different views, and in that culture, as in the West until really the 19th century, in the 20th century, women were subordinate to men, and in many ways their property, their chattel. Daughters belonged to their fathers until they were sold to their prospective husbands for a bread price, and then their husbands, in effect, became their owners. And that view, characteristic of biblical times, was characteristic of, the United States, for example, until the 19th century and the passage of the amendment giving women the right to vote. So there's a case where we as a society have rejected the biblical view about the status of women, just as we have rejected biblical views about slavery and other issues, have moved beyond them, but still many of us find in the Bible inspiration and a kind of support for a broader openness to people of whatever status they may have.
You know, let's actually end on that note, because slavery is a great example of people using the Bible for whichever side of the argument that they want. Slave owners made arguments that used the Bible, right? And people who fought against slavery also used the Bible in arguments, didn't they?
They both did. Actually, the slave owners had the better case if they were using just the Bible, because slavery is approved of in the Bible and divinely approved of.
As long as it's not an Israelite, right? As you know, if you take from other countries, that's fine.
Yeah, although an Israelite could be a debt slave for a while, so it's complicated.
Are they not open-minded? Okay, could even be an Israelite, depending on the situation.
Yeah.
Okay. Professor Coogan, it's been an absolute pleasure. You know, what I say all the time to people is read the Bible. You'll be amazed what's in it. And you've, of course, taken that to another level. And now I'll be telling them, read God and Sex, what the Bible really says. It's a great book. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Jen. Thank you very much.
All right. We're going to come right back, talk about net neutrality.